All right. Thank you for coming back for yet another episode. This one was a long time in the making. Had to get a new laptop because it died the day we were supposed to record the first time, but we got it all fixed. So thank you for sticking with us, Dan. Um, hey, are
Hey,
you
it's my
crazy?
pleasure.
Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let this awesome guy, Mr. Dan Koboldt, introduce himself.
Hello. Yes, I'm Dan Koboldt. I'm the author of several books, one of which we're going to talk about today. It's my first time appearing on the podcast, so I'm happy to be here. And I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in St. Louis, and now I live in Central Ohio.
Okay. I didn't realize this was your first podcast ever. That's you've been an author
Well,
long
I guess
enough, I
it's
would
my first
figure.
time on your podcast, not any
Oh,
podcast.
oh, oh, okay. I was just say, wow, you've been a professional author for a little bit. That's surprising.
Uh, there would be a problem if I had never been on a podcast 8 books in. I think that would be a
Yeah.
problem.
So the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we found them. So I actually found them through the amazing PR person for Bain, Army veteran Sean Korsgaard. And then when I said we were having him on the show, Doc, who unfortunately couldn't be here because we're recording while she's at work, she's like, well, why didn't you just ask me? I know Dan. And I'm like, well, you didn't tell me you knew him. So that's the story, and we're sticking to it. But before we get started, Dan, you get to ask the religion, or you get to answer the religion question. So, Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Ooh. I'm more Star Trek.
Okay, what is it about Star Trek that you like more?
Um, I think I just grew up watching The Next Generation, and it was more formative for me. I like them all. I like all those properties. But I probably have seen the most of Star Trek.
Okay, so and because we are polytheistic, thank you, Doc. We've got the next one to see whether we stay: Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, or the Wheel of Time.
Oh, hmm. Boy, that's a tough one. I Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time. So, I mean, in terms of religion, it's definitely Lord of the Rings. Read that in fourth
Okay.
grade, and I didn't read Wheel of Time until much later. Same thing for Game of Thrones. So, in terms of like affecting my childhood, that's definitely Lord of the Rings. But again, I like all of those. I just finished the full Wheel of Time. I was very excited. Brandon Sanderson finished that up. So hoping Game of Thrones get to finish too.
One day, maybe, maybe Brandon Sanderson, like you said, will finish that for him. Um,
Wouldn't that be funny?
Yeah, I actually met Robert Jordan before he passed. I was passing through Charleston, and he's a nice fella. He was very
Oh
classy
wow,
gentleman. So,
wow.
all right, because we like both the fantastical and the science fiction, and the scientific, I should say. What was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
Oh, it was fancy. It was Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Okay,
And
did
and it was just a simple matter of what book was closest to me when I was that age. My parents were big Tolkien fans, so they handed me when I was ready for like the big thick book. They were like, "Take this one," and I was like, "I'm done with that one." They're like, "Okay, take these three giant, chunk of Lord of the Rings," and that kept me busy for a while.
did you watch the Hobbit cartoon that came out in the late '70s, early '80s?
Oh yeah. Oh, I mean, I tried. I remember it quite clearly. I can still picture the graphics. It,
I
y- you know, it's kind of like, did you watch the early Dune that they tried to adapt like pretty early on?
yeah, I did. It was cringe.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they didn't have what it took to make those movies. And then of course now you're like the modern adaptations of both those properties are just so jaw dropping. It's almost like you want to forget what came in the past.
This is true. This is true. So, was your first memory of speculative fiction for all the things that umbrella? Was it Lord of the Rings, or was there something before that in the fantasy world for you?
Uh,
Games, books, anything, any version of the property.
I mean, I gotta be honest. There's undoubtedly some dragon stuff that came before that. I just love dragons, and so that they were a big part of my childhood. I was super into dinosaurs, of course, and so that was like my first real passion that falls into the realm of fantasy is dragons, and so I couldn't even tell you when it started. As soon as I have memories.
I don't think any. I can't imagine a boy making it out of childhood and not at least at some point in time having a minor obsession with dinosaurs.
Oh, I know. What a great, I mean, it's such a guy thing, right? Just like these
Yeah.
big meat eating things running around, totally uncontrolled and eating each other. It's fascinating. I mean, I'm still very into paleontology. I find it very fascinating.
I've actually written a short story and built an anthology around it just because I had a scene of a modern soldier fighting a dinosaur. I mean, and
Excellent.
I did the anthology around it just to justify the playtime I spent in my head writing the story, which was just wish fulfillment from my childhood.
Oh man, that first person game with Turok, where you're like kind of battling monsters and you get weapons. Man, those were good.
Yes, yeah. So did you watch Pete's Dragon 2 as a kid?
Uh, I don't remember it much. I have a vague memory of that.
Okay. So did you have a favorite dinosaur? Because I'm gonna nerd out just a little bit because Doc's not here
Oh
to tell
yeah,
me
I
no.
did. It's Stegosaurus. That's my
Oh,
favorite.
that's a perfect answer. That's mine too. I thought you'd say T-Rex because everyone says T-Rex or pterodactyl, but
I think that pterodactyl, but like scientifically, I find pterodactyl the most fascinating, and obvious reasons I'm interested in flying reptiles anyway. But no, I'm a Stegosaurus guy. Which if you probably watched like those early attempts at graphical illustration of like dinosaurs moving and living in their world, and it's
yeah,
always the Stegosaurus versus the T-Rex, and the Stegosaurus always lost. Did you ever see any of those? I was like,
I did. It was a Stegosaurus, the Triceratops, and the T-Rex were the three that they always use. The Triceratops is pretty cool too. That's my
yeah.
second.
Oh, really interesting.
So that's one of the things I have very vivid memories of watching the first Jurassic Park when it came out, and that surprisingly aged well.
It has. I mean, and they're still making it. I'm watching the illustrated series, like the animated series with my kids, the Camp
Yeah,
Cretaceous.
I watched all 4 or 5 seasons, whatever it was, from start to finish with my
It's so
sons.
good. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like, I feel like the story has wandered a little bit, but the fundamental aspect of hanging out with dinosaurs in the modern world is very cool.
Well, they had to work around the plot point of the main movie lines from Jurassic
Yeah.
World and onward. So they were kind of hemmed in artificially by the existing movie. So I think with that in mind and knowing it sort of fit in the cracks, I was impressed with the storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. But
So
no, I read Jurassic Park probably in elementary school as well. And gosh, I loved all of Michael Crichton's stuff when I was that age.
I was kind of disappointed that they didn't stick true to his books a little more because there were so many cool scenes that they left, like when the dinos swim across and they land in I think it was Costa Rica, and they start like nomming on the tourists in the book. Oh, that was just classic
Uh,
because you could just see the mom like, yeah, right. There's a dinosaur as it's eating her kid. I mean, I could just
uh,
picture that because it was like I could picture my mom ignoring me. So, um, so what is it? Getting back on track, so Doc doesn't like ground me later. So, what is it about the genre of speculative fiction that you love so much?
um, I think I have different answers for fantasy and science fiction. For fantasy, it's just pure escapism and wanting to imagine you live in a different time, different period of history, um, and go on epic adventures, like with your friends. And for me, it's pure like escapism. I love that aspect of fantasy. And then for science fiction, it's both that. I like the escapism angle of that, but like I'm also a science nerd. I work in science, so I'm into technology and trying to extrapolate the future of current and developing technologies. I just find that all very interesting and imagining how that might play out in the future. So
And that
kind of a different experience for me.
that makes me think of that scene where the scientist in Jurassic Park was like, "You spent so much time trying to figure out if you could, you didn't think about whether you should." That's
Good.
an
Yes,
epic sci-fi theme right there.
it is. Yes, I love that.
So,
I love
how
Ian
did
Malcolm. His whole character just cracks me up,
that
and
actor is
Jeff
like
Goldblum plays him so well. I mean, he's just so
absolutely.
great.
So how did your love of the speculative fiction as a genre transition into you writing stories in this space?
Painfully, painfully. I mean, it. I suppose that I like to write in general, just put words down, and when I finally, but I came a little bit later to creative writing. I mean, I was very into nonfiction writing. As a working scientist, I'm writing like papers and grant applications and things. All that requires solid writing skills, right? But and so eventually, and I'd been a huge reader for a long time, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to try and write my own stuff, and so I literally just signed up for like introduction to creative writing 101 type class. It was a night class, and I went in, and at the time you know, I was employed. I was out of school, out of undergrad, and I was thinking, oh, like I've written papers before. This is going to come naturally to me, and I'm figured I'm going to be like leading the effort. And then I was like the worst person in my class. I was just really bad at it, and it was shocking. I was like, how am I so bad? How am I so bad at this? And I've read so many things. And it's a very different exercise to read versus to write, and to write stories versus to write nonfiction. So it was a long, painful road, but that class like introduced me to peer critique, because we did just the classic, like everyone writes a story and we all critique the story. And we had a very good instructor who led us through that process about how you work and improve to like develop your craft. And so that was like the start for me. And the only consistent feedback I got about my stories, which were fantasy, is, uh, gee, this really feels like something part of something longer, like more epic. Because clearly I was just meant to write novels and maybe not as much the short stories. That's what it was clearly trying to tell me. So that's how I got started. And then, I think it was like 8 years later, I had my first book published or something. So a long road.
So did you ever go back and tell that teacher, professor, whatever, that you made it, that he
Oh,
helped?
great question. I did. I went back um, and saw him. He was getting ready to teach another 101 class. I looked up when it was. I saw he was there. I went in on day one of the class. I just stopped by, and I went in to tell him, and I showed him my publisher's marketplace, um, announcement of my first novel getting picked up by HarperCollins, and he was so happy and tickled and amused by that, and we hugged. It was just I just stopped by for a few minutes, but his students were all like starry eyed, like, "Oh my god, I'm in this class where he started, and he's coming in saying he's got to deal with HarperCollins." It was a really cool experience. I'm glad I managed to do that.
And his students, it was probably encouraging for them to know it's possible. I think that helps
Right.
sometimes.
I that's what I told him. I was like, it can happen. This is where I started. I do nothing, and this is how you got to start. You got to start somewhere, right?
That's cool. That would be right up there with being able to like take one of Brandon Sanderson's classes.
Oh man, some of those are online. It's almost like taking his classes.
Yeah, but I mean, could you imagine the difference of sitting in the classroom? And doesn't have to be Brandon Sanderson. He's just the most known. I probably the same if George R. R. Martin was teaching a class, just like somebody who's clearly been there and done that, and they're the ones sitting in your teaching you this class. It's like, no, I better listen to everything they say and write shit down. Stuff. I mean, stuff.
No, I mean, if you had that opportunity, especially watching his career grow and seeing what he's been able to do, like, man, you're like, we should go back in time when he wasn't like immensely well known and popular, and like try and get in on those classes. It would have been very cool to do.
Yeah,
Well, he
and
probably doesn't have time for it anymore. I just honestly, the thing I wish I could learn from him the most is how to write that much. Like the guy churns out 5,000 words a day reliably,
he's
and
done some interviews where he talks about his word count, and they're not that high a day. It's a lot of butt and seat time. I mean, it's just
maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's just he really dedicates the time to it. But for me, like I feel like I'm a slow writer, and that's my great tragic flaw. It's like I'm
mine
very,
too. I
very
feel
slow.
that. He was saying something, between 2 to 3,000 in one of the interviews I saw words a day, which is like right where I'm at. I know some of these authors that are churning out pulp style books, and I'm not talking about quality. I just mean they write fast. They're like writing 10,000 words a day. But Brandon Sanderson also has said he writes clean, so it's not as much wasted. That probably helps too. But yeah, that man's just got a crazy wicked work ethic. So Maybe one day we'll even get him on the podcast. But until then, we
Oh,
get
that'd be cool.
you, and you are just as cool. So many authors will let their own real life experiences influence the stories they tell. So were there any specific formidable moments that shaped you as a storyteller?
There. I mean, there are. I'm just not sure I'm willing to admit to all of them. Right. I mean, there. The first book that we're talking about. I mean, the first in this series with Bane is called Domesticating Dragons, and that for me was a lot of that was based on my early career in genetics when I worked at the one of the genome sequencing centers that did the Human Genome Project, and so a lot of those like little interactions that I had or things that happened to me or like time I got in trouble, all that like I drew on those a lot for the book, and I had this very personal connection to it, which I'm trying to keep on the DL because I still work with many of those people, but it's that is definitely something I slipped into some of my stories, especially the science fiction ones.
Okay, so you've been following all that stuff with the CRISPR and all of the gene stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean it's very relevant to our work, and we have gene therapy trials going on here where I work now, and so I'm totally up to speed on that. And in some ways, that's the easiest part to write of the science fiction series is the genetics and engineering aspects of it, because I feel like I'm drawing on the non-creative side of the brain, I'm drawing on the logical side of the brain for a lot of that, and so it comes easier. I feel like the true creative part of writing, that's where I like flail sometimes.
So do you watch a lot of one of the strong themes in a lot of sci-fi in space fantasy, looking at you Star Wars, is the cloning aspect. Do you think generally speaking, like sci-fi gets that right, or are they wildly wrong when they're writing about cloning?
Uh, Cloning. I mean, you're talking about Star Wars, like Clone Wars and Stormtroopers and stuff. I think that
Right.
much like everything in Star Wars, it's 10% fact, 90% entertainment, and I'm perfectly fine with that.
Okay. I've seen others. Wool, I can't remember his first name, wrote a book called Coming Home, where it was they actually cloned people and then they sent the cloned content out into the stars, and then they sort of built them in a vat when they got there to populate the various planets, and they raised them like in a simulation in a tank of yeah. So I mean, it was purported to be hard sci-fi. I don't know enough to know. I just it was an entertaining story, but
Yeah, I mean, there's cloning is one branch of, I guess you could broadly consider it genetic engineering. I'm personally I'm not that interested in making copies of people or organisms. I'm far more interested in what we can do to manipulate the genetic code of especially of living or soon to be living creatures. That for me is the area of greater impact for biomedical
there.
reasons and just personal interest for me.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, and it'll be a lifetime before we find out. But remember, there was a scientist in China that used CRISPR to try to get rid of the AIDS gene, although he didn't ask the patient. So he went to jail, and it's China, so he's probably not around anymore to ask questions. But yeah, that was a story a couple years ago. I'm curious to see what comes out of that, if anything.
Yeah, no, I think there were two children, if I'm not mistaken, that I know who that is. With no need to name the person, he's in enough trouble, but sort of did it without ethical approval and at a time when everyone was hesitant to use genetic engineering on human embryos, just did it and like told everyone about it later. It was very surprising. And then I think the useful purpose that served is it made everyone in the community realize, oh, we need to like maybe voluntarily put a pause on this until we understand what the implications are. And
Yeah,
so, yeah, I mean, that's got to be several years. The kids have to be several years old now. So,
yeah. Hopefully they're doing well. But so one of the things I think people get wrong on cloning is they automatically assume the personality will be the same too. Like
that's
it'll
funny.
just be a mirror. You see that in some sci-fi. I'm like, well, they would be raised differently, so they would behave differently. So like that's the one thing that's amusing. This isn't cloning per se, but have you read the Bobaverse? The where essentially they clone the code with the robots, the AIs.
No.
We are Legion. We are Bob.
Oh, I mean, I've heard of We Are Legion.
Yeah, he basically this guy dies. I don't want to give too many spoilers, so I'll keep it generic. And they upload his consciousness onto an AI, right? Like
Hmm.
because he's
That's
there,
it.
and then that AI makes copies of itself, and so it talks about like the personality fragments because every copy is slightly different. And so it's amusing if you're into that kind of stuff. It's not human because at that point it's a robot essentially, but you might dig it. You should check it out.
Yeah, I will.
So, all right, so we're going to transition from me asking all the nerdy questions and we're going to talk about you. So, transitioning from the writing and the science side, let's talk about things from the fan angle. Have you got anybody doing any cosplay of your stuff or made cool fan art yet?
Oh, I wish. No, I would love to see somebody cosplaying any of my properties. And if anybody ever does, please let me know. Like, get on my email newsletter and tell me about it because I would love that. That would be awesome. And it hasn't happened yet. I haven't had fan art much really that I've seen, except I did commission this very talented artist to do some sketches for the Dragon books, um, which are amazing. And I didn't really have a purpose or use for them. I was just like, hey, do you take commissions? And they said yes. And I was like, this is what I want. And so I just had these like dragon sketches and then an illustrated dragon art produced. And I love it. Like I'm just a nerd for that stuff. And also it's always good to give an artist work, right? Because it's
Yeah,
something I have no ability at, much like musical stuff. Like I have no ability in music either. But I was like, no, so I don't know if it counts as fan art because I, the author, commissioned this and paid for it. But that's the closest
you're a
I've come.
fan of the art, so that counts. We'll,
Right.
we'll
I
go
mean,
with
that's
it.
true.
So, the other cool thing that I've seen fans do. So if you're listening and you want to, show it, that's kind of cool. I've had fans take pictures of books for various artists of them reading it in various cool places. So like my favorite is a guy took a picture with my paperback copy of my book, probably one of 12 of the paperbacks I sold. Most of mine are all ebooks of like reading it when he was in Iraq. So that kind of
Oh,
stuff would be
cool.
cool too. If you've got his books and you're in somewhere unique, take a picture reading it. Those are always fun to look at. Um,
I've definitely had friends. It's mostly like other authors who are reading my book. Do that for me. Like have a photo of them read my book or of my book as they're taking it somewhere to read, and I love that stuff. I mean, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. So, has anybody since you started writing asked for your autograph?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely I've done like formal autographing sessions. Like I did one at Worldcon a few weeks ago, and so naturally, that's what the that's what somebody comes up to your table for is they want your signature on a book, and so that's I've done some of those, but I don't have the huge draw that someone like in that particular session. It was like me and a few friends of mine, and then Shauna McGuire. So it was like nobody for us, 200 people constantly in line for Shauna McGuire. But I've had, there are just people who are fascinated to meet an author in person and just want to get my autograph for that. I haven't had that experience of like being out on the street and someone like recognizes you in your face and then asks for your autograph. I haven't reached that level of fame or anything yet, but I've definitely signed things for people. Sometimes not even my books. They're just like, oh, will you sign my autograph book or something like that? I love that.
Absolutely. Do you remember the first time someone asked for your autograph?
Um, I I remember my first book signing. It was in 2016, and it was at this bookstore in my community. We had 20 25 people show up, and it's always funny how book signings work for most authors who are not super bestsellers or anything. It's generally not like total strangers. For the most part, it's like people who know you and have some reason to be interested in you. So it was like I had a few coworkers there. I had like few writing friends there, family, friends. Those are the people that came to my first thing, and so I autographed books for all of them. That was like the most memorable thing for me, and it reinforced for me that getting support from your tribe and or your circle of supporters, whatever that might look like, it's going to be so important throughout your whole career.
Absolutely. So, have you ever spotted anybody out in public reading your books?
Uh, I've definitely spotted people buying my books, and that's fine. That's good enough for me. I haven't like been on a subway and seen somebody reading my book, but No, when I was at Worldcon, there was a big bookseller in the central area of the exhibitors, and so I, like several other, was kind of hanging around that area and talking to people, meeting folks, and I would see people just like pick up and buy one of my books. And I love that. And it's so funny because we're talking about my Bane books today, and there are definitely people who um, just go there and they buy a stack of Bane books. That's all they get. Like they just, and like my book would sometimes be in the stack, and I was delighted. So they're just, it's very interesting to see other people's book buying habits, and when I'm part of that, so much the better.
Bane is unique in that they've got an audience that buys Bane as the brand, as opposed to most publishing
Yeah,
houses. I like X book. I couldn't tell you who published it, right? And so
right.
I think that is a unique thing for Bane, and they
It is.
cultivated that from the beginning.
They have,
Um,
and you can really pick them out on the shelf. That's the thing. They have a very distinct appearance to them that makes them very easy to spot, and they don't look like any other books on the shelf. And so they clearly have been paying attention to their brand, and it's amazing. I That combined with how good they are at distribution. Like I took photos of my Barnes and Noble just like a few weeks ago, and because of the distinctiveness of all their covers, and I happen to know many of the other Bane, like I zoomed in that photo and I took that photo and started drawing little green arrows where there were Bane books on the shelf of like current Barnes and Noble shelf for science fiction or something. And I stopped at like 25. I mean, that's how good their reach is and how distinct their books are that really stand out. It's easy to see them on the shelf.
so do you ever go in, now that you started writing, do you ever go into like a Barnes and Noble or Books a Million or whatever bookstores are left and be like, oh, I know that guy, that guy, that guy, when you're
Oh yeah,
walking down the.
I do that all the time. I actually did that with my daughter like a few weeks ago at our local Barnes and Noble. We went in because they had posted, they know I'm a local author. I'd stop by and they had posted, oh, look, we got some of these books. And they held up my book saying, just came in. It was right when my epic fantasy book, Silver Queendom, came out from Angry Robot. And I was like, let's go up there. So we drove up there. I brought my daughter because she's a huge reader. And, I autographed the books for them and met some of the booksellers, which was a lot of fun. And then we just wandered around and we went over to the science fiction fantasy section. And I was like, there's my friend, there's my friend. And, you know, authors tend to do this thing for each other. I wonder if you've done this for anybody, JR, is like turn our friends' books face out if they're not face out. Like I do that for my friends. And I'm like, oh, let's
Oh
turn
yeah,
them face out.
I've done that.
Or
Oh
your own. I mean, I've definitely
yeah.
do my own.
So the other funny one is when people will take the mystery books and they'll like turn them so you only see the spine, like the pages. Like I that amuses me. That's like like a dad joke, kind of thing to
It
do.
totally
But
is. Yeah.
and I've seen them do. One of the local authors I know went because his book was there anyway, and he did that to the whole mystery section. I'm sure the people working the retail that had to fix that were not as pleased as we were, but we're sorry.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so finally, what would be the weirdest or funniest interaction with a fan you've had since you started writing?
Hmm. Weirdest or funniest? I mean, I don't think I've had too many weird interactions with people. This is for me. This is the funniest. This happened pretty recently. So when my books come out, I try and get guest posts out there, and I had a guest post on a pretty well-known science fiction author's blog, and then like a week or two later, I got an email from a guy, and the name looked really familiar, and I was like, why is that name so familiar? And it was about my book, and it was reaching out. Well, it was a guy who I had gone to school with, but we grew up next to each other when we were like 5. And that's why I remembered I was like, that's why his name is so familiar. So we were like 5 years old. He lived in the house next door. And my only real memory of that time was once I don't know, we must have gotten in an argument or something and I bit him. And then his mom brought him over and showed the bite marks that I had left, and I got in big trouble. That was literally my only memory of this guy from my childhood. And so he emailed all these years later. We connected and we were just chatting. And I had to be like, who'd have thought that kid that was biting you all that years ago might someday have a book out? Isn't it funny? And so that's like the most recent fun interaction I've had with somebody. But he found me and recognized me because of my name, but just stumbled upon me because I was doing the blog tour and stuff to promote the books.
Did he remember the bite mark?
I think so. I think it was probably a memorable experience for him too.
All right. So this is where we talk about everything you have written, Dan. So the wild world that is Dan Koboldt. Like, what's the Reader's Digest version of your body of work?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I mean, I wish I could give you visual aids because I have all my books, around me. But so my first 3 books were a trilogy with Harper Voyager, starting with The Rogue Retrieval. And that's a portal fantasy about a Vegas magician who goes to a medieval world and poses as like a wizard on the other side. And then after that, I have these books with Bain. I have Domesticating Dragons, which is near future science fiction about a genetic engineer who goes off to work for a company that makes customized dragons for like retail sale, kind of like Build-A-Bear Workshop meets Jurassic Park. And so the second of those books just came out. It's called Deploying Dragons. And so I have that. And then I have an epic fantasy I mentioned earlier, Silver Queenum, that just came out from Angry Robot. And lastly, I do nonfiction as well. So I have 2 books that are for writers that are published by Writer's Digest Books. Putting the Science in Fiction and Putting the Fact in Fantasy. Both of those are based on my long-running blog series where I invite experts to come share tips about their area of subject expertise as it applies to writing fantasy or science fiction.
That's actually kind of cool. A lot of authors that do the how to get rich writing books, they make way more at that than their standard whatever, but it's just the same recycled.
I'm not qualified to write about that. So.
Yeah, but this is a unique, you are a working scientist, so you definitely are qualified for that stuff. I've seen there's another series where like an EMT wrote how to write, believable like medical injuries, that kind of thing. Those are the kind of books that are actually helpful for writers. So I will definitely have to check those out because science and I were not friends in school.
It's funny. Well, I mean, it's funny because that Putting the Science in Fiction is me and like 40 of my closest friends because I couldn't write about everything.
Right.
So when I started this blog series, it was for me starting to talk about genetics first, and then I was like, well, there's a lot more science that I can't really speak from a position of expertise about, but I could find those people. So I found, engineers, doctors, chemists, and, all kinds of subject matter experts to come and I would just ask them to do 2 things. I'd be like, right, let's write a blog post. I just want you to tell me, what do people always get wrong about your area of expertise in their books, shows, whatever. And then second part 2 is like, how can you teach them enough to be dangerous to get the details right, just enough for the average person who's not an expert in your field? And so it's like those little tips of nuance, those experts here, like, hey, if you mention this and this, then I'll know you have some basic understanding of my area of expertise and I'll buy the rest, So that's what I asked them to do. And that's kind of how the book came about is with this long running series. And it seemed like a good idea to make it into a book. So we've done that twice now.
I will get with you offline to get a copy of that. So that sounds interesting. I enjoy science, like from the lay person. Like I read the science articles, but when it starts getting really technical, my eyes glaze over. Yeah. I barely made it out of Betty Crocker calculus. So like science and math, I enjoy the ideas behind it more than I do like the actual sciencey science of it.
Well, that's funny because science is such a specialized field, right? I mean, there's so much specialization that for me, even as a working scientist, like I don't know all the physics of space travel, and so just because I happen to be a scientist doesn't mean I'm capable to speak about that. So I use the book as much as anyone else, right? I'm like, oh yeah, I need to have gravity in here. How does that work again? Like look up that chapter in the book.
Oh, that's glorious. All right. Well, we are going to pause for a moment because we're at that point in the interview, dear listener, where we're going to shamelessly shill for the man. And the man happens to be sitting with us this time. So thank you for sponsoring this episode, Dan. But we're going to roll that beautiful... Oh, I can't say that.
A newly minted PhD, Noah Parker is thrilled to land a dream job at the hottest tech company in the American Southwest, genetically engineering new lines for their feature product, Living Breathing Dragons. Desperate to create the perfect family pet, Reptilian Corp hopes to put a dragon in every home. But with his newfound access to the company's resources, Noah has a secret goal: modify the dragon's genetic code, bending them to another purpose entirely. Domesticating Dragons by Dan Koboldt and BaneBooks.com.
All right, thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And so, so that's the first book in this series. But the
Yep,
public relations person for Bain assures me that the second book in the series stands alone. So that's what we're here to talk about.
that's true.
Uh,
They do stand alone.
so where did you come up with the premise for the larger universe? How did you come up with the idea that is the series?
Oh, I mean, it's really just me trying to combine two things I love, right? I told you I love dragons and I love genetics. Like that's my day job. And so I was like, I wonder if there's some way to combine this. And that's kind of what I came up with. The genesis for this company in the book that the main character goes to work for is that they are working to control a real world ecological problem, which is feral hogs in the United States. Do you know about feral hogs?
I do.
Yeah, I imagine you did. So, especially people who live in the South or Southwest, feral hogs are descended from domesticated pigs, but now they've adapted to live in the wild. And boy, they survive extremely well. And they're difficult to control, but like a group of feral hogs can decimate entire plots of farm crops and ranch land. And so their populations are very difficult to control. So the premise of this book is that um, this half crazy inventor comes up with the idea that they're going to develop an engineer, a predator to specifically to control the feral hog populations because they're difficult to control and hunt even for professional hunters of hogs. They just live in the worst areas and tangled thickets and they're in bogs and swamps. They're hard to get to. So they decide to develop this reptilian predator. And of course, they call it a dragon. And that's how the company is established, is selling these things to control feral hogs. And then they want to domesticate those and sell them to families for like use as pets.
So the feral hogs, you can release a regular just farm pig, and within its lifetime, it will develop the traits that make it feral pretty quickly. And I've seen them get up several tons in size. Um, I know some people that were in the infantry with me that got in the business of hunting those
Oh yeah.
as a business in the South when they got out, just because they like guns and they like to hunt. And
Yeah.
I mean, they can eat the pigs when they're dead, so they team up with a local butcher and they've got a nice little shindig going. So it's an interesting premise to see what that looks like. And it's one of the more dangerous wild creatures because it has no fear, and it's like the honey badger almost in its willingness to attack things. And it's been known to kill small people's like kids and adolescents because they'll trample them.
Yeah,
That's
they're
a cool
dangerous.
premise. I enjoy that. I never would have thought of that as a genesis for a book. What made that be what inspired you?
Well, that what I was like, I'm always thinking about how can we make dragons in the real world, right? And the science is kind of getting to a cusp where some of that could be possible. Like we have sequenced the genomes of many organisms, we know the full genetic code. And there's a branch of science called synthetic biology where you build an organism from the genome sequence up, right? So extrapolating forward, like if you could make anything, what would you make? And I was like, well, naturally, I would make a dragon because why wouldn't you? They don't exist now, and we all want them to. So it was my idea to have something like that happen. And so that was the genesis for the book and for the idea of like, and then there's world building around that. Like, well, how does this company come to be? What do they try and do? How do they exist and persist in a world where you can make anything? Because I might want dragons. Other people might want unicorns or something else that doesn't exist. So
That is, and what that does to the ecosystem, because natural predators wouldn't exist yet for a creature you just made. So that's fascinating. So before we dig in, we're going to take a moment and we're going to look at this glorious cover. So can you tell us the story of this cover? How did it come to be? What was your role in its creation?
Oh, my role in his creation is I wrote the book, and it's kind of funny because publishers are different about how they handle covers. Some of them are super proactive and engage the author a lot, and they want the author to drive some of the creative process. But Bain, as we discussed, they have a very specific look to their books that they have worked on, and so I felt like with Bain, I was going to let them take the lead because they know how they want their covers to look, and they know what their audience goes to look for. So with my first book with them, Domesticating Dragons, like they said, give us several ideas for scenes that might be used for the cover. And so I did, and they picked one of those, and it was great. Then for this one, they didn't even ask me for that. They were like, boom, here's your cover. And it's funny because the guy on the cover is not a main character. He's kind of a side character. He's the half crazy inventor who started the company that I told you about. But it is a scene in the book, and it's just so epic. Like, it so captures the juxtaposition of science fiction and fantasy. I was like, all I could say is, wow, I love it. I mean, it's great.
So if you could work for this company you created, would you?
Oh, totally. Oh, I totally would.
The cool thing is if you look on the cover, and I'm not going to be able to zoom in because the copy of the cover I got on the Google search engine wasn't that great, but that backpack he's wearing for the flight suit, the jetpack, if you would, that looks a lot like the one that's in the Fort Eustis Transportation Museum, which is in Fort Eustis, Virginia.
Wow.
That was built back in the 50s at the height of the Rocket Man craze. That was based on I think it was a comic book before it was a TV show. It became the movie that you're familiar with that came out, I think, in the 90s. The Rocketeer was sort of based on that kind of stuff. That started with them attempting it in real life, and that gives me those vibes because I've actually seen that on a mannequin, which is kind of cool. I wonder if your artist did too.
I mean, there are a lot of parallels. It's very cool. And, it reminds me that in addition to this scene happening in the book, I allude to something that happened in the real world, which is recently in California, I think it's in the Los Angeles area in the past few years, there have been a couple times when airline pilots have reported what appears to be a guy on a jetpack at like 10,000 feet. And
wow.
It doesn't get what I would think would be the appropriate amount of press coverage because I'm totally interested in that. And it got like a brief blip of coverage, but it's happened a couple times where it's like multiple reliable airline pilots say, yeah, I see what seems to be a guy in a jetpack. And, it's not like they can zoom over and go take a look at that, but there's somebody that's got a functioning jetpack out in California. I love the idea of that. It's probably
the tech is somebody. The tech is there. The issue is the fuel consumption is such that its flight time is very limited. And I imagine it's hard to control. I've actually seen videos where they've made a modern version of the one that was built in the 50s, and they actually did a demonstration. I think it was a Danish ship where they basically had Marines wearing it and take the ship with it, launching from a platform, which is kind of cool. So yeah, the tech is getting there. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's actually some crazy inventor out there like tinkering.
Right.
Which is kind of awesome and kind of scary at the same time. But moving on to the book itself. So what would your 30-second elevator pitch for Domesticating Dragons be?
Well, the pitch is this.
Oh, excuse me, Deploying Dragons. We're here to talk about book 2.
Okay. I mean, I'll happily pitch both of them. But the premise of the world is that there's this company that makes customized dragons for use in the home. Book 2 is when they're approached by the Department of Defense to develop customized dragons for use by the military. And so they face a whole bunch of new challenges, including going through the DoD acquisitions process. And so it's, which anybody who knows anything about it's a very involved process. So the premise of the book is that they're trying to land this contract with the DoD, which essentially will secure the future of the company if they can win it. But the specs are very demanding, and trying to produce dragons that meet the needs of the modern military is a significant challenge.
Okay. And so book 1 is Domesticating Dragons, where they create them. Book 2, Deploying Dragons, is where they decide to try to put them to real sort of use in the field, so to speak?
Yes.
All right. Now, are you going to at any point put a rider on the back of that dragon? Channel your inner Anna McCaffrey?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, it's I would love that. I also have people ask me, like, are you going to be able to get me a dragon? Because they know I work in genetics. Like, how close are we to these things? I'm like, oh, I wish we were closer. Do
your dragons breathe fire?
It's It's funny because I have a story about that that's going to go up on Bane.com later this month. They do not right now, and that is definitely something that people have been requesting. Oddly enough, podcasters always ask me about that. So,
I mean, it's just so obvious, right? Like the standard trope of the dragon breathing fire. So
it is. I mean, I think that this book, I pitch it as hard science fiction because there is a lot of real world science. I mean, there's also some stuff that's not necessarily scientifically accurate at this time, but um, hard science fiction with breathing fire is a tough combination to pull off. And so that's what the premise of the story, it's going to be up on Bane.com, is about them trying to develop a fire breathing dragon for the company. It's very entertaining.
outstanding. All right. So what is it that makes your dragon series special, do you think? What makes it stand out?
Well, I think that first of all, I have not read every dragon series, so I can't say that this is unique to mine, but there are not that many that have dragons in a science fiction setting where it combines real world science and genetics with a creature of myth and legend, right? You could argue some places have done that, and actually, when Anne McCaffrey wrote subsequent books in Pern, it like went back in time to the founding of those establishment of those planets. There was all this science about how they made them, and I think it was a genetic engineer who developed the dragons of Pern or something. But that for me, in terms of modern books where there's a strong scientific presence, a strong scientific basis, there isn't that much out there like this. So I think it's a unique juxtaposition of science and fantasy.
Okay. So which tropes do you feel like deploying dragons hits the best?
I think that it probably hits the science fiction trope of the whiz-a-jig cool technology thing and what are the implications of it. I mean, there's so much great science fiction about that. Like, you have this new thing, this new technology. Here for us, it's dragon printing technology, like customizing dragons and being able to create different ones rooted in genetics. That's the unique thing that they can do, and exploring a world that has dragons in it has been the most fun for me.
So how do they go about, and obviously no spoilers, but in your universe, are they printing them almost like a 3D printed living organism? Is it hatched like we saw in Jurassic Park? How are they creating these, generally speaking?
It's they print the eggs, so they design it, they have a biological printer that creates an egg that they then incubate or ship out, depending on if it's somebody orders it. Because initially, in the early drafts of the book, my editor was giving feedback like, "Hey, how are they going to, get these dragons out to customers who buy them and like might live across the country? Because shipping an actual dragon seems like that would be very complicated." And I was like, "Yeah, that's true." Well, I was like, they could ship them out as eggs. That'd be probably easier. So that's what happens in the book when regular run-of-the-mill customers order like the Rover dragon for their family pet. They get shipped an egg with instructions on how to incubate it for a couple weeks, and then it hatches, and boom, they've got a dragon.
So did you make, when you designed your dragons, did you design sort of the behavior pattern? So is it like a pack animal? Is it solitary creature? Like, what kind of dragon did you create for this world?
Well, without going in too much into the reasons why, a lot of them are based on real world dog species that perform specific functions like in modern society. So
Okay.
you have a lot of so they're generally loyal creatures, and some of them have special purposes. Like, there are hunting dragons, there are police and law enforcement dragons that are kind of like German shepherds. And so a lot of them are modeled on real world dog species and breeds that have been adapted to certain purposes.
So I would assume then it's your dragons vary in size based on the
Yes,
subspecies, I guess, of dragon?
they do.
Okay. So what genre or subgenres, other than hard sci-fi, which you mentioned? I don't know if dragon is a subgenre, but it should be. But what genres or subgenres do you feel like deploying dragons fits?
I mean, I think there are aspects of military science fiction in it necessarily because of what they're trying to accomplish in this book. And that is slightly out of my experience level and comfort zone for writing. I enjoy reading that genre a lot. It's like a subgenre of science fiction. But that's a new step for me, is the military science fiction aspect of it. And then also, I would argue, especially more in the first book, there's a thriller, like Michael Crichton-esque thriller aspect of it, techno thriller aspect to it.
Okay. Was Michael Crichton then a large inspiration for you? I mean, we've
Oh
talked
yeah,
about in the beginning you loved his books, but
right. No, it's he was, and I like so many of his different books and how he balances, um, the science and medical fact with good storytelling. It's kind of funny because, you could ask somebody, well, what genre is Michael Crichton? And I think that's a difficult question to answer. And I guess they would best call it a techno thriller or something like that. But you could also just say Michael Crichton is pure science fiction. That's what it is. I mean, everything there is not has speculative elements that don't exist right now on the planet. So,
okay. So let's talk about the story itself. So what can you tell us about your main character? What makes him or her unique in the crowded field of sci-fi?
well, um, so my main character, he's a young guy in his 20s. He's a genetic engineer. The reason he went to work for this company in the first place is he has a very close personal experience with genetic disease, and so in the back of his mind, he was wondering if there might be some technology here or a way to adapt their technology to help people with rare and incurable genetic disorders. And that, I freely admit, comes pretty close to my day job in working in a children's hospital in the field of genetics. But he's so he has this interesting background where came from a lot of pure science, but he's also a programmer. So he developed software that like helped with the design of the dragons, and that was how he got a foot inside the door at the company in the first place. So he's got a unique mix of skills, and I think he's an interesting guy. And he's when he comes to this company, he's not unlike me. He's not like gaga over dragons, as many people who would go for a company like this would go to work for a company purely because they love dragons. Who wouldn't do that? I would do that just on the basis of loving dragons. But that's not his story, and that's not his reason for coming. But he over time he becomes like a dragon lover, and it's inevitable, of course, because that becomes his day-to-day job. But he really comes over and ends up being on the side of dragons on a lot of things. I think it's very interesting for him. It's like personal journey.
Okay. So, and this is just, Saint George, the famous saint from the United Kingdom, supposedly killed the last dragon as his claim to fame. So, do you play on any of that with the religious aspect? Because I could almost see cults forming around pro and con of these kind of new creatures that are being invented.
um not the religious aspects of it, but there is some, especially in the first book, there's more some aspects of what you might call the PETA community, and people asking like, should we be doing this? And you're creating these creatures, do they have rights like animals do? Like the PETA crowd would argue that they do. And it's very interesting because the main character has this romantic interest, and she's very much on that side of social and ethical issues. And so it's a source of entertaining strife in their relationship. Uh, she's very pro conservation and not necessarily in favor of genetic manipulation, and he obviously works for a company that does that for its bread and butter. So makes for some interesting interplay between them. But that's more the angle I explore is animal rights and what it means when you create something that's totally new. Does it have the same rights as an animal that lived here and has existed here on the planet?
Okay. So, were there any secondary characters that were especially memorable to you?
There are two I think that I hear the most about. First, this guy on the cover that we're looking at, that's Simon Redwood, the crazy inventor, and he shows up in every book, and he's kind of like what everyone would want their hero slash half crazy inventor to be like if you met them in person. And so you don't see him a lot, but he kind of shows up at these pivotal moments, which is something I very much love. And then The other side character I hear about a lot is a dragon. His name's Octavius, and he's the main character's like pet, and that he designs and prints pretty early on in the first book. And so Octavius is like his constant companion, and they get into all kinds of hijinks together, which I think is a lot of fun. And it's one of the most common things I hear people say about my book, like, "Oh, I want an Octavius too," and I'm like, "Me too. I would love that."
So can the dragons talk, or is it more based on the dog where, maybe some barking or whatever, but not like vocal conversations?
It's more that they don't talk. I think that would be too much of a stretch. But they have ways of communicating and letting you know what they want, just like a dog or a cat would. Like people who own those animals know exactly what their animals want a lot of the time, and it doesn't take spoken language to get there.
So do you cover the learning process as they develop these creatures on like learning their traits of what a dragon is? Because I mean, the very first one, like they're making everything up as they go. So do you cover any of that in the books?
Um, it's hard for me to understand exactly what you would consider covering it, but I would say um, defining what they can do from the basis of starting point of this is a reptilian creature with four legs and a tail and teeth and kind of like a dragon. What else can we do with that? That part is explored a lot because throughout the book they're often creating specialized types to solve a problem, whether that's a customer request or a market opportunity or the need for this contract they're trying to land in the second book. They're trying to adapt this creature into whatever niche it's needed to fill.
So as far as like traits of what is a dragon in your book, it's a lot in keeping with what we understand of reptiles.
A lot of it is, yes. I mean, and there's the creature that they make has parts of a lot of real world creatures and some of those traits of those real world creatures in it. It's not just reptiles, but some of that is exploring what are other fascinating uh, bits of nature that have genetic origins that could be brought in and adapted to meet some specific need for the dragons. That's something, especially in the second book, where they're trying to create creatures that have to hit very specific requirements, which is a feature usually of DoD contracts. A lot of times they look to the natural world for inspiration for some of those things. Like, okay, well, it has to fly really fast. Let's look at nature and see what wing design has evolved to support the fastest horizontal flight for a bird, for example. And so they often go looking at that because nature has had the benefit of thousands or millions of years of natural selection and evolution to find the perfect answer for many of these problems.
Okay. So do you have covered the creation of maybe like an origin story of the very first dragon? Is that covered in your series, or does it take place after?
No, it's funny, JR, because you clearly have something in mind that you hope is in there. And I'm just telling you, it's probably
No,
not.
I'm just, random questions because I find origin stories of the things fascinating. So I'm imagining the very first dragon that hatches and they're like, okay, now what do we do? And I just imagine that would be fascinating. I like the stories for sci-fi, for instance, of the very first FTL in any given universe. Like I
Mhm.
find all of that, just the what if possibilities are just amazing.
It's true. I mean, I think the origin story angle for them, this is mainly what the first book is about, is they create this thing that's a predator to control wild hog populations, but they want to take that and make it into a family pet, and that's like a big leap, right?
Oh
Making
yeah.
something that's purely wild and aggressive into something that can be safe to have around children. That's a very different type of creature, but they want to keep some of these fundamental aspects the same. And so that for them is this scientific challenge, but I draw a lot on what has been studied and discovered about the history of domestication of animals in human history, right? We have several domesticated animals, various forms of livestock, plus dogs and cats. And the story of the domestication of each of those is different. And it's very fascinating now that we have the technology to study the genetics for things like, you know, domesticating dogs from wolf ancestors. That's like a pretty classic definition. And clearly, wolves were taken as pups and selected for the right traits to have their loyalty and have them be protected for ancient humans. And that's not very hard to understand, but domestication of that cat was very different. It was more of a problem solving exercise because it happened at around the time humans developed agriculture, and as a part of developing agriculture, they could store grain, right? And when you store grain, what does it draw? It draws rodents, and you need some way to control those rodents. And so the history they think of how cats were domesticated is that they sort of domesticated themselves. They chose to come in and take up residency in these early silos and warehouses where grain is being stored because they get a source of food and some safety and protection. And in return, they eliminate these pests. And so the notion that cats chose to domesticate themselves is very fitting with anyone who owns a cat and knows what their personalities are like, which I just find it so great.
So does your story have any bad guys that you could tell us about without giving us any spoilers?
Well, I mean, the person that our main character butts heads with is the head of the company. His name is Robert Greaves. And in the first book, it's because he's the CEO and essentially he controls a lot of the aspects of the company that maybe our main character would like to change or adapt to his own purposes. And so, in that sense, he's an antagonist, right? But what's interesting is about when I wrote these books and we sold the first one to Bain, at the time there was this guy who was like the chief of security who was the bad guy of the book. You know, he's the very obvious bad guy. And when Bain came back to me, they said, you know, we like this book, we'd like to buy it, but you have to be willing to make one change. And I said, really? And they said, here's the thing. Our audience has a lot of ex-military, a lot of police, etc. And they said they're going to meet this guy and they're going to assume this is a good guy, not a bad guy. And so you probably can't have him be a bad guy in this story. I was like, wow, you know, I didn't really think of that. But so he is not a bad guy now. He's sometimes an antagonist, but he's ultimately not a bad guy for the story. And that was something I changed, you know, out of respect for the Bane audience. And so I'm happy with how that worked out.
Okay. So speaking of characters, so if yours ever met you in a back alley, you know, you sometimes do horrible things as authors to characters. How do you see that interaction playing out?
I think mainly probably with a lot of sarcasm. Because I mean, my main character is snarky, and so am I, and we both think in certain ways and have scientific backgrounds. So we have a lot of more things in common than we do different with one another. But you know, any author's job is to somewhat torture their characters, right? That's what people go to fiction for, is to see characters suffering and then have them find a way out of that suffering. So I think anytime an author meets their characters, there's a risk of some discomfort because of that.
Okay, absolutely. In mill sci-fi, it's will I survive the experience is often the question.
I like that.
But yours is a side. Well, depends on if you had to wrestle one of your dragons. But you know,
Well, yeah, if I meet one of the dragons, that's a different story.
as long as they don't think you're a feral hog, you should be okay. So,
Well, go ahead.
since we talked about characters, do you have a favorite character archetype when you're writing?
I probably do. That's very interesting. No one's asked me that before. Granted, and as I told you, it's not my first ever podcast interview, but I very much like the mentor archetype. You know, older mentor teaches the main character the ropes about something, and then usually leaves the story in some way, often dies. But I love that archetype mostly like from a position of a fan. I love seeing that thing, like somebody teaching the next generation of hero how to do something that they're going to need to survive. And I love that. And when I can inject that sort of thing into my book, I can. When I can, I do.
Okay. So can we get a quick peek behind the curtain? Were there any cool scenes or ideas that you had to cut from either of these books that would make a cool story, even if you potentially use them later?
There is. So I actually had it in this second book, but ended up removing it I had this series of events where they, because they're trying to customize these different dragons, they and they're trying to fill markets, that niche markets. They end up like the main character, like in a particularly snarky mood, comments like, "Well, if all we care about is marketing, why don't we just make a dragon that like carries a message and then dies immediately after that, and then the customer has to buy another one if they want to send another message." And of course, he makes the mistake of saying that in front of marketing people, and they're like, "Oh, could we do that?" Because marketing people, they love that idea, and so he, because he opens his mouth, and that's often a source of trouble for him anyway. He gets tasked with trying to make this happen for the company, like as a potential production model, something called a one-way dragon that that basically would be small, flying dragon. It would carry a message, and when it delivers a message, it would die, which is fun to think about a world where that exists. Maybe a little cruel for dragons, but he. So the challenge of creating something that would have that kind of existence is something I worked on, and it was maybe going to be part of this book, maybe it's going to be part, but ultimately I wrote that as a story for Bane.com when the first book came out, and it's up there for people to enjoy. It's called One Way Dragon, and you can find it now.
Cool. So finally, what can you tell us about the universe? In miniseries, the worlds where the story takes place is as much a character as the protagonist or antagonist. So can you give us a hint of what we can expect? So obviously we've got flying dragons, so science has evolved on the genetic end. We've got the jetpack, so that's progress. What other changes to the technology can we expect?
Well, I mean, it's near future science fiction, and I try to write things that I think are uplifting about science fiction. So it's probably the biggest difference about my world in this book is that, especially when the series starts, there aren't really any dogs anymore because they were wiped out by a canine epidemic, which is something, by the way, I wrote before COVID-19. And so that's one of the reasons this company comes into existence and tries to fill these market needs is they don't have dogs anymore to fill a lot of the roles. If you think about it, dogs fill a lot of roles in our modern society. I mean, we have, in addition to just pets, there are seeing eye dogs, there are junkyard dogs, there are police dogs, bomb sniffing dogs. I mean, they do a lot of things for us. So, in a world where dogs are gone and we have to fill those with something else, why not dragons? That's my idea. So, that's something I explored a lot in the first book, and then it's still something that persists throughout the rest of the series.
Okay, so so near future? Then it's just Earth based.
Yeah. Oh,
As far
yes.
as not okay.
It takes place in
Um,
the American Southwest. I mean, the company's based in Phoenix, so that that was a chosen location and very intentional because it's hot out there, and heat is good for reptiles and reptile eggs in particular, most of the time. So it was a natural place where you might try and situate a biotech that was trying to grow and sell reptiles that come in egg form, right? So that's where the company is founded, and that's where a lot of the scenery takes place. There's some things where our protagonist goes out in the desert for various reasons. That's one of the things I love most about that is that southwestern flavor of it.
at any point in time, will you add snow dragons? Because that would be pretty cool.
I'd like that idea. I mean, I think there may be a time when they were trying to design a dragon that had to live in cold and at high altitude, and they were trying to address some of the challenges there. But I like that. Maybe that'll be like my third story in the universe. It'll be Snow Dragon.
So deploying dragons is clearly part of a series. We've talked about domesticating dragons and deploying dragons are the two books out right now. But is their story done? Is there going to be more from these characters?
I hope so. I really like the series and the world. I think Bain has done a wonderful job. What I probably need to do is come up with a really great idea for what they should tackle next. So I'm open to suggestions if you got any.
So if you're listening, dear listener, leave it in the comments. I'll tag him so he can see it, and who
Yeah,
knows, you
please
might
do. Tell me what
inspire
you want
his
dragons
muse.
to do next.
So, of all the technology that you invented for this world that we've talked about for the last hour, what would you want for your daily use?
Ooh. I mean, for daily use, probably just a pet dragon. I mean, I don't have any practical reason for wanting that other than loving dragons. But the computing systems, more practically and less glibly, the computing setup they have out there in their company is very sweet. And it's a fact about modern research, especially in my field, genomics, that compute is very important, and having access to compute is critical to do a lot of the work that we do. And so they have essentially almost astonishing computing resources. And that could be me living out a fantasy where I had access to those kinds of resources.
That would be cool for a lot of reasons, although that might give us Skynet. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, you got to be careful. It's true.
So normally we would ask you how you would use and abuse that technology, but it's dragons, and I don't think there's any ways that would be acceptable to talk about on air about abusing lovely dragons.
No,
We're just not those kind of people.
No, we're not.
So, when you create your creatures, in this case, you created dragons, but in general, how do you go about doing that? Do you let your nightmares inspire you, folklore and legend, or given your background, do you focus on like real world science and changing things when you're making up these fantastical creatures to include in your books? And this could be all the other stuff you've written as well. It doesn't have to just be the Dragon series.
I'd say a lot of the inspiration comes from the natural world. I'm really into nature and the outdoors. I'm an outdoorsman and a bow hunter, so I spend a lot of time in the woods, especially this time of year. We're recording in October, so it's prime bow hunting season where I am in Ohio. So I love the natural world, and nature has found incredible ways to solve problems and to persist and survive. And I find that endlessly fascinating. I'm the kind of guy that loves those documentaries about the planet and the species and how they've adapted to these environments. I love all that stuff. So that's often a source of inspiration for me for any of my writing, is like sharing some version of a really cool story that comes from our own natural world.
Okay. So if you like documentaries, you should check out Curiosity Streams. It's like the Netflix for documentaries. I call it Nerdflix, but there's some awesome stuff there. It's not too bad on the price point. So it's definitely worth looking at. And there's definitely room, I would think, in the natural world for inspire everything from aliens to monsters. So that's definitely a good place to start. But since this interview is winding down, was there anything about deploying dragons that we didn't ask that you wanted to tell us before we wrap up?
I mean, you kind of alluded to this, but I don't know if we stated. You didn't ask, do you have to read the first book first? And the answer to that is no. I mean, I actually know a number of people didn't read book one, just read book two, and they were not bothered by it at all. So it's not like a series where you must start at book one. You certainly can, but you can start in here if this sounds like it's more of your kind of story, and I don't think you'll be lost at all.
So is this available? So I'm assuming since Baen is putting that out, there's this audiobook as well as ebook and paperback.
Well, the first book has an audiobook. The second one doesn't yet, but I'm hoping it'll get produced soon.
Okay. Well, I do know that some prominent audiobook narrators have had to take temporary leave of absence for health reasons. There's been a couple I've heard about. So I imagine there's a current backlog in the production of audio content.
There is. I mean, there's a backlog in everything these days, isn't there?
This is also true. But the other problem is the amount of time it takes to record it versus the post-production cleanup is another just natural body where what do you call it, choke point for audiobooks anyway. So
very true.
So I didn't ask this, but before I forget, what is the age range for this story? Like for the readers, like what would you say would be appropriate?
I would say this is PG-13, and so it's pretty clean overall. There's like some language, but it's definitely PG-13. Like a teenager would be just fine, and probably an advanced middle grade reader would be just fine in reading this. There are no F-bombs or anything, so I try and make it pretty family friendly. Was
that intentional or just your style?
It's both. I mean, it's my style. That's just all my books have that rating. When I get asked this question, I'm always like, PG-13.
Okay. So before we let you go, dear listener, we'd like to remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. And as I've said before, writing and reading is a symbiotic process. So you want them to write more books you love, you got to leave the review so their other readers will find them, read them, buy them, and make it worth their time. And publishers very, very happy when you leave those reviews. So
Yes.
do your part. We do it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Goodreads, BookBub, all the places. And if you're really daring, start a website and leave reviews there. And if you do start a website for reviews, reach out because we'll have you on to talk about it. Because that's an interesting topic in its own right. But now that we are bringing this puppy home, Dan, can you tell listeners how to find you?
Yes. My website, dankoboldt.com, is the easiest place to find me and learn about my books and such. But if you want to talk with me, I'm on Twitter quite a bit. My handle's Dan Koboldt. Or if you join my mailing list, then we can talk by email too. So reach out. No, I love talking to people who are into this stuff and interested in science fiction and genetics and those things, or just fellow dragon lovers. So I'd love to hear from you.
And we've been doing some fireside chats lately, Dan, about various topics. And at some point in time, we might even bring up genetics and science fiction, and we'll have to have you back.
Oh, I would love that.
Because those are fun, like bringing the science to the everyman. We like to have those discussions. So,
No,
all right.
Keep me in mind for that.
Absolutely. So you can find us, dear listener, on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email the show at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook where all the shenanigans happen at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. You can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters tech blades. Anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. I started to give the other website, but it's not ready yet, so I apologize. It's the Anchor FM one still, where you can also support us for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on, or you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly intoxicated. They will drink until their liver surrenders. And at that rate, we really ought to get some alcohol companies to sponsor us because we talk about our drinking habits all the time. And sometimes we actually even drink the drinks we make jokes about. But anyway, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.